Hello, so the first muscle I'm going to be doing is the longus colli. The longus colli is located on the anterior side. It originates from C3 all the way down to T3 and then inserts, C1 through C6. The actions that this muscle performs is lateral flexion, unilateral rotation to the same side, as well as flexion, making it bilateral.
Next, the rectus capitis posterior minor originates just above the major on the spinous process of the C1 and inserts again on the neutral line of the occiput and also creates bilateral extension of the neck. The rectus capitis posterior major originates on the spinous process of the C2 and inserts on the neutral line of the occiput, creating bilateral extension of the neck and unilateral rotation of the neck to the same side. The rectus capitis posterior major originates on the spinous process of the C2 and inserts on the neutral line of the occiput, creating bilateral extension of the neck and unilateral rotation of the neck to the same side. So the oblique capitis superior originates on the transverse process of the C1 and inserts between the neutral lines of the occiput, just around here, and creates unilateral lateral flexion of the neck and bilateral extension of the neck. So the oblique capitis superior originates on the transverse process of the C1 and inserts between the neutral lines of the occiput, just around here, and creates unilateral lateral flexion of the neck and bilateral extension of the neck. The oblique capitis inferior originates on the spinous process of the C2 and inserts on the transverse process of the C1, and this muscle creates unilateral rotation of the neck to the same side. Next, we have the interspinalis muscles, which occur between the spinous processes of the C2 through T3 and the T12 through L5. And this muscle creates extension of the back. It is neither bilateral or unilateral because it is only one muscle between the spinous processes and is not paired on either side. The next muscle we have is the intertransversari, which occur between the transverse processes of the C2 through C7 and the L1 through L5. And these muscles create bilateral extension of the back of the vertebral column and unilateral lateral flexion of the vertebral column. The next muscle we have are the rotaries of the vertebral column, and these muscles originate on the transverse processes of the vertebral column of the lumbar through cervical vertebrae and insert on the spinous processes of the lumbar through cervical vertebrae, stopping at the C2, and these muscles create unilateral opposite side rotation of the vertebral column and bilateral extension of the vertebral column. And lastly, we have the multifidi muscles of the vertebral column, which originates at the sacrum of the vertebral column and the transverse processes of the vertebral column, and again insert on the spinous processes of the lumbar through cervical vertebrae. And this muscle again creates bilateral extension of the back and opposite side rotation of the vertebral column.
Next is the anterior scalene. The anterior scalene originates from C3 through 6 and then inserts on the first rib. The actions that this muscle performs are lateral flexion, unilateral, and then unilateral rotation, opposite side, as well as flex, making it bilateral, and elevation of the ribs when you inhale, making that bilateral as well. I don't know if we're supposed to name elevation or not, but I did. Next we have our middle scalene, which is our pink over here, that originates from C2 through 7 and inserts on the first rib as well, just a little bit behind where the anterior scalene inserts. The actions this muscle performs is lateral flexion, making that unilateral, unilateral rotation to the opposite side, and then elevation of the ribs as well. Lastly, of our scalene group, we have the posterior scalene, which is our blue right back here. It originates from C6 and 7, and then inserts on the second rib. The actions this muscle performs are unilateral lateral flexion, unilateral rotation to the opposite side, and then elevation of the ribs as well. Next, we have our sternocleidomastoid, which is our lightish green over here. It inserts at the top of the sternum head and then inserts at the mastoid process. The actions this muscle performs are lateral flexion, unilateral, unilateral rotation, opposite side, and then flexion of the neck, making that bilateral. The next muscle we have is the semispinalis capitis. This muscle, sorry, a piece of our tape came off. This muscle originates from C4 all the way down to T5, and then inserts between the line of the occiputs. This muscle only has one action, which is extension of the vertebral column. The next muscle I have is the splenius capitis. The splenius capitis is our navy blue color back here. I know you probably can't see it, but anyway, it originates from C7 all the way down to T4, and then inserts up here at our mastoid process. The actions this muscle performs are unilateral lateral flexion, unilateral rotation, same side, and then since it is located on the posterior side, it is going to extend the head and neck. The next muscle I have is the splenius cervicis. This originates from T3 through 6 of the spinous process, and then inserts on C1 through C3 of the transverse process. The actions this muscle has is unilateral lateral flexion, unilateral rotation to same side, and then since it is located on the posterior side, it will extend the head and neck bilaterally. The last muscle I have is the quadratus lumborum. It originates from the posterior iliac crest and then inserts on the last rib and the transverse process 1 through 4 of the lumbar vertebrae. The actions this muscle performs are unilateral lateral flexion of the vertebral column, and then unilateral lateral tilt, which are the hips moving upward of the pelvis.
So my next muscle is the iliocostalis, and the origin is the common tendon right here, and the posterior surface of ribs 1 through 12. It's right in here. And the insertion is the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, and the lower cervicals, that's up in here. And the action is lateral flex of the vertebral column to the same side, and bilateral extension of the vertebral column. My next muscle is the longissimus, and here's the origin right here. The common tendon and the transverse process of the upper 5 thoracic vertebrae. And the insertion is the lower 9 ribs and the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. The actions are lateral flex of the vertebral column to the same side and bilaterally extending the vertebral column. The next muscle is the spinalis. The origin is the sphenius process of the upper lumbar and lower thoracic vertebrae, and the insertion is the upper thoracic and sphenius process of the cervicals except for the C1. And the actions are lateral flex to the same side, lateral flex of the vertebral column to the same side, and bilaterally extend the vertebral column, leaning back. So is the external oblique, where the origin is right here in the 5th through 12th rib. The insertion is on the anterior side of the iliac crest. So the actions are lateral flex, same side, and rotation, and bilaterally it flexes the vertebral column. So my next muscle is the transverse abdominis, and the origin is on the iliac crest, and the insertion is the same as the internal oblique, right in here, and the action is compress. My next muscle is the internal oblique, and its origin is right in here on the pelvis, and then the insertion is on the lower rib and also right in here, and the actions are lateral flex to the same side and rotation and bilateral flex of the vertebral column. And the origin is the pubic crest, and then the insertion is the ribs, and it flexes the vertebral column.